say, but that's a big, nice surprise.
Yes, yeah, it's amazing. One. Give a better chair. Okay.
Morning, Adam. Okay, yesterday we were discussing the story with tzitzit, right? The man made tzitzit, and the problem was he didn't make it in the right way because he went ahead and he only put in one string instead of having four strings. And then after he put in the one string, he went ahead and he tied the string. He made the 5 knot, and then only then he realized his mistake. The question is it good enough to now just snip the ends of the string of those strings to make it into 8 strings, or is it too, or is that not enough? Does he have to actually untie the whole thing? That was a discussion yesterday, and we ended off, we're like in the middle of a piece over there on 11, on Yud Aleph on base, 11b, most probably it's 11b1, right? Morning, Jaime. We're on 11b1, where it says Ika di Amri. It's in the first column, the left column, Ika di Amri. Ika di Amri Omer Rav Matna. There's another version of the story. Good morning. Rav Matna said the following: Bididi havi uvda. I had a story that I hung, morning, Dr. Rosen. I hung one tzitzit in the garment, and I came in front of my Shmuel to ask my Shmuel, is it good or it's not good? We are on 11b1 on the left column. And what did Shmuel say? The great Rabbi Shmuel said, V'amali, he says, Psulim l'olam. They are puzzle forever. So therefore, it's not good enough. If I hung one tzitzit in and then I tied it, I made the knots, and then I want to go ahead and snip it after that, it's too late, because the way it was made, it needs to be when you make the tzitzit, when you make them, now they're made in a kosher fashion. But if they were made in a non-kosher fashion, because you did not have the proper strings, because you only had one string, you didn't start with 4 strings to fold over to 8. Once you made it and it was made, now to go ahead and snip it is too late because it was already made. It's already made, and you have to make sure you snip before you make the strings. That's what the Gemara says. So meitive. So now that the Gemara is going to try to refute Rav's opinion. Because Rav said, you know what? Even if you did not snip it earlier, even if you only started with 1 string and you tied the knots, Rav says as long as you cut it at the end, that's called you made it. Now the Gemara is going to show you that we have a very strong question on Rav. What's the question of Rav? You hung the tzitzit, you placed one tzitzit, you placed the tzitzit in, and you didn't, and then only after you placed it in, you cut it, and meaning you placed it in, you made the knots, and then you cut it. Psulim. It says it's pasul. So we see that the fact, even though you cut, here it says clearly, you tied it, you put it in, you tied it, and then you cut it, it's no good. So that's a big question on Rav. V'u Tanya Gabi Sukkah. And also we have a Braita by Sukkah also showing us not like Rav. Where do we show not like Rav? Because what does it say in the Braita? It says the following. Taseh v'lo min ha'asuli. The pasuk says, Chag HaSukkot ta'aseh lecha. You should make the holiday of Sukkot you shall make. And the Gemara understands that means when you make the sukkah, the schach is the main part of the sukkah, so to speak. When the Torah calls it something a sukkah, it refers mainly to, a lot of the focus is on the schach. That's where the word sukkah comes from. Sukkah is from schach, the covering. When you make the sukkah, when you make the schach, you have to make the schach in a kosher fashion. Therefore, it says in the Braita, taseh v'lo min ha'asur. It has to be made properly as schach, but not if it was made in a non-kosher fashion. Therefore, mikan amru, if you made the schach in a not kosher fashion, how did you make it in a not kosher fashion? The Gemara says, Hidla aleas gefen vesadlat. If you went ahead and if you hung on top of the sukkah, you had a vine, and the vine was still attached to the ground, and you went ahead and you placed this vine on top of the sukkah, or this glass, or this gourd, or this squash plant, or sakisos, or on some certain types of reeds that are attached to the ground. V'sikecha gaban. So when you place this schach, you placed it was not kosher. Why was it not kosher? Because you placed it was still attached to the ground. And then you threw on top of this not kosher schach, you put some kosher schach on top. But the majority of the schach was not kosher schach. What does it say? Psula. It says in the Braita that if you use the vine as schach, the Braita says it's invalid. Now, the Braita does not give us more details. What is the case? You just left it as a vine attached to the vine? You did not cut it? Is that the case of the Braita? Again, what does the Braita say? Right, Ms. Haven's case. What's the case? You placed a vine on top of the sukkah, and you threw some other kosher schach on it, and it says it's invalid. That's what the Braita says. Now, there's an obvious question. If you did not, let's see what they go, and what's the issue? And what's the reason why is it pasul? What does the Braita say the reason why it's pasul? Because it was made in a not kosher fashion. The way you made it was you placed that vine which is attached to the ground on the sukkah. So now why is it invalid? Because it was made in a not kosher fashion. So the Gemara has a question. Are we talking about he subsequently cut this schach, or he didn't subsequently cut this schach of this vine? You hear the question? It says in the Braita he placed the vine on the sukkah. It's invalid. What is the case? Did he also cut it? Or he didn't cut it. So it sounds like he didn't cut it. So the Gemara says if he didn't cut it, so the reason why it's invalid is for a different reason, because it's attached to the ground. It has nothing to do with the law of Tasa v'lo min ha'asur is by something which is, even if it subsequently is detached, but if it was made in a not kosher fashion in the beginning, it's not kosher even later on. The fact that the Braita says that the reason why it's a problem is because it is tasev, it was originally made in a not kosher fashion, sounds like that he did cut it, but even though you cut it later on, but since originally it was made in a not kosher fashion, you got to make it kosher from the beginning. It's not good enough to make it afterwards to fix it up. It's not called a good fix. So the Gemara wants to prove that this case of the Braita is a case that you subsequently cut it, and nevertheless it's no good. But that's not called enough of a fix. And therefore, what we have to do, you have to pick up all the schach and move the schach around. So the Gemara says, "My ira ilem hechidami." What is this case of the Braita? Ilema b'shelo katsasan. If it's talking about you did not cut the vine and you left it attached to the ground, Adam. So my ira, why are you telling me the problem is mishum tasev lo min ha'asur? Why are you telling me that the problem is because it was made originally not in a kosher fashion? You can tell me typically the muchubarim ninu. Tell me the reason why it's invalid is because it's attached to the ground. So therefore, the Gemara says b'shekasasan. You have to say that this case, that the Braita is saying that it's not kosher, even if you subsequently cut the vine, but since the placement of the vine was placed on when it was not cut, so it was made in a not kosher fashion, it's not good enough just to cut it later. Ukatani psula, shma mina. So we derive from here, this is what the Gemara wants to prove as a knockout, so to speak, as a strong question on Rav's opinion. The lower minan, we do not consider satan zuhiasiatan. We do not consider the cutting of the branches as if it's like you made it now in a proper fashion. To yufta the Rav. And this is the question of Rav. That's what the Gemara wants to suggest as a strong question of Rav. Now the question is, how can we defend Rav's position? Do we have a way to defend Rav's position? One of you does. So Amalach Rav. So the Gemara says it's not a knockout. Rav has a way to get out of this question, to defend his position. How would he defend his position? So the Gemara says, how did he cut the branch from the vine? If he would have went ahead and used a tool, an instrument to cut the branch from the vine, so it's very recognizable this is cut material. And it's very recognizable that it's detached. And Rav would say that would be fine. But here we're talking about, the Bryce talking about when he used his hands to pull off, to yank off the vine from where it was attached. So when you use your hand to pull it off, and it wasn't an open cut, so it's not so clear, it's not so recognizable that it is detached. So that's why the Breita said it's no good. But if it's clearly recognizable that you really did a real act of detachment, a nice cut, and it's recognized, everyone sees the cut, then the Gemara wants to suggest that Rav would say that would be good. So in this case, if it's not recognizable, so it's a good question, Mr. Bates. It's not recognizable the cut. So even if you would lift up the schach, it might not be. That's a good question. Does it look like? Would there be a maris ayin question? Does it look like? Does it have an appearance that it's not cut? So that it might not be good enough, even if you lift up every piece. If you cut it with a tool, then if everybody would agree, if you lift it up, that would be great. Because lifting up is just like you put it there for the first time. Yeah, that's the remedy if you cut it and then you lift it up. To lift up every piece of the schach. The issue here is you need to lift up every piece of the schach. And Rav says, once you cut it with a tool, you do not have to lift up anything. That's, as Shmuel says, no. And the halacha Shmuel, you have to lift everything up. Yes. Right, exactly. That's how Rav understands. It's like you placed it. We consider that as if this act of cutting, even though what you placed it when it was attached, it's like that's called like you placed it for the first time. What? By cutting it, even though you didn't move it, right? That's a chidush. You didn't move it, but he considers that enough of an action you did an action in the saf. How? Because you actually cut the branches, the vine. So what? In this case, in this specific case, until now, the Gemara was always talking about the issue was you actually cut it with a tool and it was recognizable that it was cut. But the question is that enough of an action? Do we consider the cut like as if you're placing it? The cut is like a placement, or do you don't see a cut as like a placement? So Rav sees that cut. He looks at the cut. That's as if we look at it like this is like now. We consider that as if you're placing it right now. That cut. But in our case, when the Gemara is now suggesting to defend Rav's position, that Rav would agree that if the cut is made not with a tool, it's made with a pulling. You just pulled it out, and it still looks like it's attached. That's not called a proper asiyah. So the way Rashi seems to be learning, Rashi says it's not called a real making of the sukkah, but just when it's not clearly cut. It could be that, but if you actually move it, that might be sufficient. Rashi didn't address Mr. Batesh's issue. What would everybody hold if you move it? Now that if you made such a yanking out, but it's not an identifiable cut, would it be good enough just to move it or not? But the fact that Rashi says the issue is it's not a siyah, that it's not a real making of something, it would seem like from that if you actually would move it, you did make it. You made it when you actually would move it subsequently, if you would move it. Now the Gemara says, Mikomokom, okay, even if, so they said, the lo mitkaras, the Gemara says, the shal, hachamai skin, the shalfino shalufei, the lo minkara asiyaditu. Okay, it's not recognizable. Now, Mikomokom, the Gemara says, Tla'on, the achachach pasak, kosher Rav. We still have a question on Rav from the first part of the Braita. Because the first part of the Braita says that if you hung the tzitzit, you put one string in, Dr. Navid, and then you tied the strings. By the way, today's share is we're dedicating memory of Uri Shoshani's father, Hanan, and also his grandfather, Eliyahu ben Rivka. So, but it says in the Braita, in the first case of the Braita, it says if you put the one string in and then you tied it as one string and then you cut it, it's no good. So we see cutting it afterwards is not sufficient. You would have to have, but it's tzitzit, you would have to redo the whole tzitzit because you have when you make the tzitzit, it has to be made in a kosher fashion. If you made it and it wasn't kosher, you can't just do something. You have to. It has to be made in a kosher fashion. Here it wasn't made kosher. So the fact that you snipped it later on is not good enough. Mr. Haber, is that clear? So that's what the Gemara said. What? Shmuel holds that exactly that if you made the tzitzit and not in a kosher fashion, and then you snipped it afterwards, so now you're going to say, okay, I now have 8 strings. But at the end of the day, you didn't make it in a kosher fashion. Same thing like a sukkah. If you place the schach on the sukkah while it's attached to the ground, right? So you made the sukkah not in a kosher fashion. The fact that you cut it afterwards, that's not good enough, right, Adam? Not good. That's what Shmuel holds. Mikomokom talon v'achachach pasak kashel Rav. The case of hanging the tzitzit and then subsequently cutting the tzitzit, you hung one tzitzit and then you tied the 5 knots and then you cut them, and it's no good. It says in the Braita that would be a question of Rav, and the Gemara says kasha. And the Gemara says it is a good question. The commentators ask that usually when you have a knockout, when the Gemara asks a question on a rabbi and the Gemara does not bring an answer, sometimes the Gemara says the word tiyufta. Tiyufta means it's like a knockout. It's like, we don't accept that rabbi's opinion because of the question. The question is such a strong question. And sometimes the Gemara just says kasha. The word kasha sounds like question, right? The Aramaic word kasha is question. What? Kasha, but it's not as powerful as tiyufta. It's not a knockout. It means kasha means I got it. You have a question, right, Dr. Nereo? You got a question. Not all questions means that it means there's no answer to your question. We might not have an answer now, but there's an answer for it, and we don't feel it's such a compelling question that it knocks out the opinion. So the commentaries discuss why doesn't the Gemara feel that this question is such a strong question. It should be a tiyufta, because it says clearly in the Braita that if you made tzitzit not in a kosher fashion, meaning you only started with one string and you tied the knots, and then you subsequently cut them, it says it's no good. So it's pretty much clear, not like Rav. So that is the question. Like they bring down over here. He says that at the end of the day, the Rif paskins, like we said, the Rif says that if you cut it afterwards, it's not good enough. Okay, so good morning, Mr. Silverman. So now the Gemara says, what? No, Rav and Shmuel are arguing. Rav and Shmuel are arguing if cutting it later on is good enough or not. Shmuel says no, and Rav says yes. And the Gemara brought a very strong question on Rav. Now, if you cut it after knotting it, you started with one string, you knotted the string, and then so you made it not in a kosher fashion, and then you snipped it. Now you got 8 strings. Is it good? No, Rav says yes. The Breita says no. Yeah, what?
Does he correlate with the Scott? And if you combine on top-
Right, exactly. Right. They if you move it, it's kosher once you cut it. But the question, but if you did not move it, is the question. That is the question. They're both similar cases. The case of putting the schach on while it's attached to the ground is tantamount to the case of the tzitzit. When you started with, you made the tzitzit with only one string. Those are the Gemara is, but you can't exactly. You can't fix the tzitzit. You would have to untie the whole tzitzit. But the schach, you have a way to fix it. After you snip it, you just move the schach. Exactly.
You can make them still use that string.
Exactly. You just have to start over again. Untie it, then tie it. Yes. So now the Gemara says, Lema Ketanoi. The Gemara says, you know what? This argument to Rabbi Shmuel, maybe we found this argument in earlier rabbis have the same argument, earlier rabbis and earlier generations. That's what the Gemara is going to suggest now. Where do we find another case that has some similarity? The Gemara is going to try to seize a case, and the Gemara thinks that the case is similar, and the Gemara wants to say, so we see that the argument to Rabbi Shmuel is an argument of earlier rabbis. So what does the Gemara say? Lema Ketanoi. So we have a story by Hadassim. You ever see sometimes there are berries grow on Hadassim. Sometimes you have a little berries, one or two berries, a few berries, right? So we cut, you ever see berries growing on Hadassim? Anybody ever see berries growing on Hadassim? What? Hadassim, we take on Sukkot, lulav, etrog, hadassim, and aravot. The myrtle branch. The myrtle branch, on the myrtle branch, which the three leaves come out together, right? The aravot, you have two leaves. The myrtle branch is three leaves. So the myrtle branch, sometimes you see berries growing on the myrtle branch. If there's too many berries, if the majority, if there's more berries than leaves, so then we say the hadass is not kosher. Too many berries. And the reason why it's not kosher is because it's not hadar. It has to be, it's not beautiful. The hadass is now, it has a foreign substance, too many berries on it. It's taking away from the beauty, right, doctor? It's taking away the beauty of, what you say? A distraction. Exactly, it's a distraction. Too many things going on over here on the, on the hadass. Too many berries. You go in and you cut the berries off. You're good. Before Sukkot, cut the berries, and now you have a proper hadass, right? The saber. But what happened was he forgot to cut it off before Yom Tov, and now it's Yom Tov. Now Yom Tov, you can't cut off those berries, and the reason that they give why you can't cut off the berries because it's like you're fixing it, because it's not a kosher hadass. You're making it into a hadass. You're making this myrtle, what do you say? So we're going to say, right. So by going ahead and you fix the hadass by going ahead, by cutting it on Yom Tov, if you cut off the berries and make it into a kosher hadass, that you can't do on Yom Tov, okay? That's not allowed. But what happened, the guy went ahead, just like you don't dip kalim in the mikveh on Shabbat or Yom Tov, right? You have a mikveh. Let's say you have a mikveh in your house, and you have a glass. You have glasses, right? Your wife just got new glasses. The glasses have to go to the mikveh, and you say, "Okay, we're going to dip in the mikveh. We can't use the glasses." I go to first. I have a mikveh in the basement. I go ahead. I'm dipping in the mikveh. Say bracha and dip it in the mikveh. I can't do that because that utensil is not usable. And now I go ahead and I make it usable. That will be a problem of what? On Shabbat. I can't dip it in the mikveh on Shabbat. I can dip myself in the mikveh. I can't dip. I mean, but I can't go ahead and dip the utensil on Shabbat. That's the same thing over here. I can't go ahead and cut the berries off on Yom Tov. But you know what happened? He didn't know the halacha. And he went ahead and what did he do? He tied the lulav. He took the hadassim and the ravot and he tied it to the lulav. Right? there's different customs how you put the hadassim and the ravot on the lulav, right? You see that many Svardim, everyone can tell me more about the Svardim than I. They actually tie it. They tie it to the lulav, right? A lot of the Svardim do that. They have a double knot it to the lulav, and Ashkenazim, they just have like this holder that they stick the hadassim on this side, the rav on this side. What is the common minhag by the Svardim? What do? They tie it with a double knot? The Iranians, I see the Persian Jews, they tie it with a double knot. Could be. What do they use? Do they use what do they use by the Svardim here?
We use the skach. We use the skach to tie ours.
But you tie it
with the
you
lulav,
tie it
with lulav. Three
you tie
ties.
it. Listen, you're from the Persian community. They do that. Well, you tie it, but okay. So whatever the minhag is. So now we're going back the way the Gemara. There's a whole discussion in the Gemara. Do you have to tie it together or not? That's the question in the Gemara in Sukkah. Do they have to be tied together, the Ravot and the Hadassim? Well, they don't have to be tied together. So the Gemara's understanding here is that what happened was you tied it together. You
They gotta
tied
become one.
What'd you say?
They have to become one. It's called lulav and etrog.
Right.
Lulav. It's not hadas and aravot and lulav.
But I want you to know halachically, the one Ariel, halachically, the reason we hold it lulav does not have to be tied. There's no special Torah law to tie them together. We hold in halachic practice, the purpose of tying them together is for beautification purposes. Is that you tie them together, that beautifies having them together as a unit together. The multicolors in one, having three different meaning tied together. But it's not that if you don't have it tied together, you're missing out on a basic obligation of tying them together. There's no, but the Gemara here is going to be discussing, there are opinions that say you must tie it together. That's called lulav shvichan agad. So here what happened was, he went ahead on Yom Tov, first of all, when did he tie it together? Now, in order to tie it together, he's making a double knot, he's making a knot. He could not have tied it, he tied it before Yom Tov, okay? He didn't tie it on Yom Tov. You can't make this thing on Yom Tov. You can't tie it on Yom Tov. So he made this before Yom Tov, okay? And then he forgot. And when he made it, he forgot and he left the berries on the hadas on Yom Tov. So now he can't just go ahead and untie it and tie it again, cut the berries and untie it. So he made it, in a certain sense, he made it in a hustle fashion. He was not made in a kosher fashion, because when he made it, there was too many berries on the hadas. So in a certain sense, it's like the hadas was invalid at the time that he made it. And then he subsequently did something to correct it. He cut the berries off. Do we say, is that just like the tzitzit? When you used one string, you tied it, and then you snipped it. We said, Rav says that's good, Shmuel said it's no good. So here we have a similar machloket. When he made the lulav, when he tied it together before Yom Tov, but he tied it together with the berries, so therefore it was made not kosher. And then he slipped off the berries, and we have a machloket. Can you use this lulav or not? Let's see the Gemara with the hadasim. Let's say it's the following machloket. Ava im ava v'liktan. Everyone have it? The bottom of 11b1, right bottom. Ava v'liktan. He violated the law. He violated the law by cutting the berries off on the Yom Tov. Pasul. Divi Rav Shimon ben Yotzadok. Rav Shimon ben Yotzadok says it is invalid if you went ahead and you cut off the berries on Yom Tov. And Rabbi Chachomim machshirim. The Chachomim say it's kosher. You cut off the berry, it's no longer missing in its beauty, because now it's a beautiful hadas. Doesn't have the berries on the hadas. It's good. The Ruha, the people in the yeshiva thought, the Kuliyama, they thought that both these rabbis hold lulav sarich eged. Eged, I think it's a bus company in Israel. Is it still the bus company? Right. So everybody thought that you need eged. You have to tie it together. Everybody thought you need to tie the lulav with the hadassim and the aravo together. And they thought that it's a biblical law that you have to tie it together. Now, therefore, if you need to tie it together, it's like you have to make it. You have to make it a certain way. The alfinan, and they also thought you learn lulav me sukkah. We have a precedent by sukkah. What's the precedent? The precedent by sukkah is that you have to make the sukkah in a kosher fashion. You can't make it in a not kosher fashion, put on the schach and it's not kosher, and then subsequently do something and not fix the schach, and now automatically it's kosher. Like we said, if you have a haystack, right? You have a pile of hay, and then you cut out the bottom of the pile of the hay. So when you have a pile of hay, it's not a kosher sukkah. It's a pile of hay. But then if you go ahead and you dig out the bottom of the pile of hay, and now you're left with walls and the covering, it's not kosher. Because when it was made, because the way you made it was made not in a kosher fashion. So everybody holds, good morning, the same way we have this halacha by sukkah, the Gemara says we have this halacha by what? By lulav. There's something called, Rashi says, there's something called binyan av. There's 13 ways the Torah is nidreshet, right? Rabbi Shmuel Omer, b'shlosh esei midot, the ways the Torah is nidreshet.
We say it every morning. We say it every morning.
Right. One is a kal v'chomer, and one is a binyan av. What is a binyan av? When the Torah gives us a law by one situation, we say that law is not limited to that story. That's a precedent that should apply to other similar situations, unless you have reason to make a distinction that it should only apply there and not here. So if the Torah tells us that, when you make a sukkah, you have to make, when you make the sukkah, it has to be made in a kosher fashion. When you place the schach has to be placed kosher. Not that the schach was placed in a not kosher fashion, and then now you have it was a kosher schach, and then something came about that now automatically should be kosher. It doesn't work that way. When you make it, it has to be made in a kosher fashion. So the Gemara thinks it applies, the same thing applies when it comes to lulav. When you make a lulav, and the Gemara's understanding that you need to make a lulav in a certain fashion. You have to tie the hadassim and the aravot to the lulav. That's the opinion of the Gemara at this point. So therefore, the same way by sukkah, you have to make, when you make it, it has to be made kosher. So too, not that automatically later on something happened and it becomes kosher without you making it kosher. So too, when you make a lulav and lulav hadassim, you have to make it kosher. And therefore, in this situation, it wasn't made kosher because it was tied, the hadass was tied to the lulav, the myrtle branch was tied to the lulav, and it was made not kosher because it had too many berries on this hadass. So therefore the Gemara says, everyone holds the alfina lulav misukkah, diksiv, it says by sukkah, kaseh, you have to make it in a kosher fashion, v'lo mina asur, not that it just automatically becomes kosher, but not that when it was made not in a kosher fashion. So my love, so what is the argument over here? If everybody holds of this concept, it has to be made kosher, and when you make it, you have to make it kosher. So why are they arguing? Why is there an opinion that says that if you cut the berries off, you're good, but it wasn't made kosher? So the answer is, my love, the one who says that it's kosher if you cut the berries off, even though you cut it afterwards, he holds Amrinan the Gabi Sukkah. By Sukkah, we say Kisitatan Zuhasiatan. By a Sukkah, if you cut the schach, you did something in the schach that we look at it like you placed it, like you said before, Henry. The cutting of the schach, he holds as equivalent, like because I did something in the schach itself. I cut the schach. So even though I didn't move the schach, but I didn't move every piece of the schach, but the fact that I cut the schach, we'll look at it now. It's like I placed it on kosher. It's like making it. And the other opinion says cutting is not like making it. So we see over here, the gabi lulav arminan, and by lulav, we look at the same thing. When you go in and you cut off the berries, it's like you're making it. Now you make it. We look at it like you're making it now. You're putting together. It's like you're putting it together, and therefore it's kosher. The kitasa zu iyasiyata umande pasel, and the one that says that it's not kosher if you cut the berries off on Yom Tov, he holds Lord mina. We don't say gabi sukkah ksisas iyasiyatan. We don't look at the cutting of the vine that it's considered like you're making it now. You didn't move the whole schach. So gabi lulav nami Lord minan. By lulav, we also don't say likitata and zuasiyata. By lulav, we're not going to look at the picking off the berries as if you did an action in making it in a proper fashion. You're not allowed to take the berries off on Yom Tov because you're now making the hadas. You're creating it into a real
Muktzeh.
kosher.
It's muktzeh, Rabbi. It's muktzeh.
You're fixing. We're talking about Yom Tov.
It's muktzeh.
We're talking about Yom Tov. What'd you say? But it's okay. It's a good question because at the same time you are fixing the hadas. At the end of the day, the hadas was not kosher with the berries, but there were too many. There was more berries than leaves. No, you can't. If you hang it, if you have apples hanging from your schach and you're hungry on Yom Tov, Urach Halamoed, you're not allowed to eat that apple. Why? Because you designated that apple for a mitzvah of decoration. You can't take any decorations throughout the holiday. You can't take any decorations off the wall, off the schach, and say, I want to use it for personal use. You can't use that. You can't do that because you designated it. What? Right, because that's because it was designated for its mitzvah. Unless the Gemara said before you hung up the decoration, you made a certain stipulation that you're not separating yourself from using it for personal use, whatever that stipulation has to be. But if you don't make that tonight, that condition beforehand, you're not allowed to go ahead and use any decorations for personal use. So it's not that I always have an apple handy to use to eat. That it won't be able to be done. So that's what the Gemara wants to suggest. The Gemara found the case, law, and reason, right, Ms. Neighbor? Found the case, the berry case, the Hadassim case, and the Gemara wants to use this case as perhaps compare it to our Gemara, to our case of the Sukkah and the Tzitzit, and wants to say that the same way we found that, and we found early rabbis arguing in the case of the lulav. So Rav and Shmuel, it's not a new argument. Each opinion has what to rely on. And this also, by the way, could be why it's not a knockout punch on Rav. The Gemara had a good knockout on Rav before. But now that we found a way to learn that Rav has a Tanah, has an opinion in a Braita that goes like him, an early rabbi, so you can't knock him out from one Braita. Because the Gemara's challenge for a rabbi was, I found an early rabbi that says not like you. But now we found an early rabbi that says like him. So the fact that you found a Tana that's against him, he has a Tana with him. So maybe that's why the Gemara did not say earlier, we knocked out Rav's opinion. That's why the Gemara says Tasha. It wasn't a total knockout. Right? It's a strong challenge. So the Gemara says low. The Gemara says we are not compelled and forced to say that this argument by the berries on the Hadassim is the same argument of Rav and Shmuel, of cutting the schach after you put it on while it was attached. Why? The Gemara says it's not compelling. It's not compelling to say that we have an early argument. The Kuli Alma Lo Amina Lagabi Sukkah Kisisatan Zuyasiyata. Maybe both these rabbis would hold, we don't say cutting the schach is good enough. If you place the schach on while it was attached to the ground. You can't have schach attached to the ground. And you place it that way, it's not good if you just cut it afterward. You have to move it around. The issue over here is do you learn lulav from sukkah? The one that says that it's kosher when you cut the berries off afterwards. He hosava lo yalfina lulav misukkah. There's no law. The fact we don't learn out lulav has to be made in a kosher fashion, the same way we learned out sukkah. Sukkah, we know we have on record, you have to make the schach in a kosher fashion. Do we say that law also applies to making the hadassim and aravot in a kosher fashion? Or maybe hadassim and aravot, as long as at the end of the day, everything is kosher. You got the berries off, it's good enough, even though you didn't make it originally in a kosher fashion. So this, the Gemara now wants to say, it could be that the argument of these rabbis is you have to make the hadassim and the aravot when you tie it to the lulav. Does it have to be tied in a kosher fashion to begin with? Is there such a particular halacha like we find by sukkah, or only it's a unique halacha maybe by sukkah, maybe by tzitzit, but it does not extend to the lulav? And that's what the Gemara, and that's the question between these two rabbis. I don't want to keep it, we're praying upstairs at 7:26. You have a beautiful davening, a beautiful day, a beautiful Shabbat. We're back on Monday.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi, reading Rabbi Yishmael, you acquire those 13 ways of the Torah.
Right,
Okay?
exactly.
I read it right now after we finish.
Right, that was the Binyan Av, exactly. Beautiful.
Yeah, and you get all the Kavachomer, Gezerah Shavat, you gain all those ways of Torah.
Yes.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi.
Shabbat. You too. All the best, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye, H.